All right, welcome to the second half of the MRC Biostatistics Unit Armitage Lecture Day. I'm here, Vern Farewell, here with David Spiegelhalter and Peter Armitage for a time of conversation. 5 years ago, when we inaugurated this lecture series, Peter kindly gave us a talk on the history of medical statistics, with a particular reference to the unit and some of its forerunners. In the intervening years, we've tried not to work him quite so hard, but I'm very pleased that this year he's agreed to this so that we can once again take advantage of his long experience in medical statistics and learn something about its development through him. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And I'm want to start basically with looking at your start in medical statistics. Now, I understand that you came to Cambridge in 1942, but then left shortly thereafter in 1943 for war work. Can you say something about this transition from Cambridge student to war worker?
Yes, the general rule in those days was that students could expect 2 years at a university before they did some form of national service. I started in January, rather oddly. I'd come up for a scholarship examination in the previous December, 41, and the Japanese took this as a signal to bomb Pearl Harbor. So when I got back, both the school and the college thought it advisable for me to come up straight away. I think a number of people found themselves in this position at that time. So I came up in the January. I had 5 terms, and left in the summer of 43. Mathematics students were generally directed towards a group of possible vocations. There were aeronautics, communications engineering, electronics, so on. Statistics was one of them, and there was a particular feeling amongst the powers that be that there should have been more statisticians than there were in that particular year. There was quite a demand in 1943 for them, and so a recruitment panel headed by C.P. Snow, actually, who later he was a physicist who wrote novels and was quite well known after the war. Later a minister in Harold Wilson's first government. And he was the chairman of this group who came along, and they interviewed me as well as a lot of other people and said, what are you interested in? I said I thought I might be interested in statistics. Oh yes, why aren't you going to Irwin's lecture? Now, Irwin was doing some lectures. I'll tell you about Irwin being here later on. He was giving some Part 2 lectures, which I didn't know about because I was actually reading for Prelim the year before. And so I hurriedly signed up for Irwin's lectures and the practical courses. I can't say that they were terribly stimulating. They were full of, full of things like expressions for the cumulants of case statistics, expressed as functions of the cumulants of the parent distribution. I thought long expressions which you had to laboriously copy down. I didn't get much of a feeling for applied statistics from it, I must say, but there it was. And so I eventually found myself directed towards a unit in the Ministry of Supply with quite a large number of other people. Although there was a big group going to SR17 at that time, this is the summer of 43, there were of course other statisticians of that particular year who did quite different things. I mean, David here was one of them, David Cox and Jim Durbin, Michael Healy, did not go into SR17.
So now, did these groups, were they in Cambridge, or were they people? Were they groups that were
they were
functioning in
groups,
Cambridge,
other
or
groups,
moving
yes.
out of it?
No, not necessarily in Cambridge. They would go elsewhere. Perhaps we can talk later about some of the other groups that were active during.
Well, go ahead. Why don't you tell us a little bit about those groups now, if you'd like.
Well, the group I went into was a group called SR17 in the Ministry of Supply, whose job was to really work on industrial statistics with particular reference to sampling inspection and quality control, and a certain amount of experimental design. It was headed by an applied mathematician called Womersley, John Womersley, And there were various sections, and as it were, the research section in it was headed by George Barnard, whom you know.
No, David might want to speak to that as well.
And I found myself put into that particular group. There were a lot of very interesting people in not only in that group but elsewhere in SR17. I found myself in a room with Dennis Lindley, who people we know very well, Christopher Winston, who later went to Imperial College and Essex, Jim Godwin, who was a very good mathematician, who moved after the war from statistics into maths generally at Royal Holloway. Two people had come the previous year. There had been a recruitment a year before in the group. One very interesting man, Arnold Baines, became later the chief statistician in the Ministry of Food. And he was a sort of a polymath, a quite extraordinary man at the age of, I suppose, it would have been 19. He seemed to know everything about everything. And a very interesting person to know. And another man, Stanley Collings, who was a Cambridge geometer, who later went into the administrative civil servant service, left statistics, but then came back to statistics for the Open University. That was that particular room, as it were, which was quite a stimulating one. In SR17 generally, there were several other people who became well known after the war. Maurice Walker, who worked in Manchester and Sheffield through his career. Peter Berman, who went into the Bank of England for his career, and is well known for the Plackett-Berman fractional factorial designs. Dennis Newman had worked at University College and is known for the Newman-Cool's multiple comparison technique.
Which perhaps we've not all heard of. But
Robin Plackett was the second in command of the research section, who George Barnard's second in command, and he of course had a very illustrious career in various universities, later in Newcastle. So those are the sort of people who were in the unit.
I mean, I knew George Barnard a bit and just remember he was such a delightful man. What was the atmosphere like there? I mean, how was he like?
It was very free and easy, really
boss?
rather academic. I mean, you tended to be given general guidance about the sort of thing he'd like you to be thinking about for the next week or two, and rather left to your own devices. And you were free to go around, although London was a very awkward place in some ways to be in during the war. We could actually get up and go out and go to the Science Museum Library and things like that. So it was an enjoyable sort of atmosphere.
I always thought that Bletchley Park gets all the publicity about science in the Second World War, and nobody mentions SR17. Can you say a bit more, some more precise things about the kind of things you're working on?
Yeah, well, a lot of the people were very much involved with practical applications of quality control and sampling inspection in the ordnance factories, so they would spend a great deal of time moving around. We tend to be rather fixed in Berkeley Square, Berkeley Square, not Berkeley Square, not Berkeley Square. Some people moved around quite a lot. Frank Anscombe came at about the time I came, but he had been for a year or two in a different grouping entirely concerned with rocket testing with Maurice Bartlett, David Kendall and Pat Moran. And he continued to be a liaison between SR17 and the people doing the rocket testing, because that's one of the areas in which experimental design came in.
Can we get on to some of the slightly more technical things? The development of sequential analysis, which I always associate with George Barnard
Yeah.
and you in the UK and
Yeah,
Paul
well,
in the US.
Yes, George had, right from the beginning, been very interested in the idea of sequential sampling. Of course, this was not an entirely new idea because there'd been sampling inspection schemes, Dodge-Robic sampling inspection schemes in the 1930s, and the idea of a multi-stage scheme was fairly well established. And there'd been various papers in the annals in the 1930s about some form of sequential sampling. And George wanted to take this up very much, and so we actually were sort of designing specific sequential type schemes from the outset. But what of course changed things very much was the impact of Walt's work.
What was the communication with the US group?
Well, we had occasional confidential documents coming over as things that would be published later on in the annals and so on would come over as limited circulation documents, and Walt's thing came over in that form. And of course we realised that this was a quite major sort of way of looking at the whole question of sequential sampling. And so we took up various aspects of this, tried to develop things, but there was always the feeling that we'd somehow got to get away from the infinitely long schemes, which were the open nature of Walt's schemes, and work with curtailed schemes of some sort. So it tied up really with the sort of ideas that were in the air anyhow there. So that was really what I was myself working on for quite a bit during those 2 years.
Now then, at the end of the war, you moved on briefly to the National Physical
Well, in
Laboratory.
1945, the end of the European War, SR-17 was reduced in size and moved to a different location, and many of the people were moved to the National Physical Laboratory, and I was one of those, in a group which the senior person then was Robin Plackett. George Barnard went off, I think, immediately to Imperial College, and so I was in a group at the National Physical Laboratory, which was, of course, not specifically industrial. It had responsibility for the whole of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, of which it was one part. So we had then had contact with quite different sorts of research units. I mean, I happened to have a contact with, for instance, with the pest infestation laboratory at one time, as did Robin Plackett, because Robin took up a very intriguing sort of line of research about mixtures of poisons with Hewlett, who was a biologist, and published a lot of papers on that. I got involved in survey methods, because survey sampling methods, because there was a problem of estimating the number of flower beetles in a warehouse, and the flower beetles were in sacks, and so there's a question of stratified sampling. You have to stratify your sampling. And so there were quite different problems coming up. At that time, the National Physical Laboratory at Teddington was interesting because they were starting work on a new computer, ACE, which Turing had designed, and Turing was there in the maths department as particularly as the progenitor of the ACE, but also as a general advisor. And so he used to wander around, he used to come in and chat about things. And he was to be seen also jogging on the footpath, the Thames footpath. He was a great runner.
Did you have any contact with the computing that he was doing?
No, it was a very early stage. I mean, I went to one or two talks by the people who were working on it as to what the idea was of the Mercury memory bank or whatever it was, but I don't remember much about it. I certainly wasn't working on it.
Now, before we're going to go on to a couple more specific topics, but before that, I mean, do you want to comment somewhat more generally on how you think the wartime work influenced the subsequent development of statistics in the UK?
Well, one of the odd things about starting in statistics at that time was that we were all so incredibly naive. I mean, we'd had very little formal tuition in statistics. I'm talking about most of the people who went into jobs of this sort. There were very few textbooks. Some came out during the wartime period, like Kendall and Wilkes. But it was quite difficult actually to get a grasp of the subject as a whole. So we were really, even at the end of the war, people were sort of thrown into the subject, not terribly well versed in it. But I think the main impact was that here were a lot of people, here was a realization that statistics was contributing something, and a realization that a lot of people around who could actually work, and universities actually started to produce, foreign departments. It's quite a long time, because before there were many professors of statistics. I mean, by about 1950, there were only about 3 or 4.
I can't resist asking, what about development of Bayesian ideas after the war? Why did it all take so long?
Remarkably slow. I think this is basically due to the tremendous influence of Fisher. Although we didn't know a great deal about statistics, we did know really what Fisher had been doing. We got his books and so on. And there was a feeling which I think was very prevalent amongst the group who were older than me, who had worked in statistics in the 1930s and had worked and seen Fisher's work developing, a feeling that really this had really cleared up the subject. I mean, here was an approach to the whole subject, entirely frequentist. It disposed of the need to have inverse probability lurking in the background. It clarified the confusion which had gone on in the 19th century, and continued to Carl Pearson, for instance. And we were, I think, quite prepared to take Fisher at his word, but in fact he wouldn't need it. And the other thing, I think, was that the people who didn't take this view, the real enthusiasts for we got to call it inverse probability at that time, I think, because the idea of calling it Bayesian was a little later, that the enthusiasts were very peripheral to the general stream of statistical development. Jeffreys, you see, was what do we call the
physicist?
A physicist. And there was a very enthusiastic actuary, Wilfred Perks. Jack Good, of course, wrote an early book. He had been in the Bletchley Park group, but again, he wasn't terribly well known to the generality of statisticians. And I think it wasn't until Savage's book became known, and the time and through the fact that Dennis Lindley became converted to Bayesianism by knowing about Savage in his travel to the States, coming back enthusiastically and talking about it, that really it sort of made much of a mark in this country.
But even then it seemed to be very slow.
Even then it was rather slow. Just going back to Jeffreys, incidentally, when I came back to Cambridge, I'd gone to lectures by Jeffreys. This was, I did a year back in Cambridge at the end of the war, and Jeffreys was lecturing. I think it's a good question as to which of Jeffreys and Fisher were the worst lecturers. I think Jeffreys probably. They were both terrible. But Dennis Lindley told me quite recently that Jeffreys didn't know anything about Ramsey. Now, you see, Ramsey, a philosopher, had actually written on inverse probability before the war, but he was no connection with Jeffreys.
Okay, do you mind me asking about sort of views, your current views about Bayesian methods? It's got this lovely quote. Okay, you said, the non-Bayesian cases rather fallen by default. Do you think there's too much Bayesian stuff around?
I think what I meant by that is that many people have written very carefully constructed arguments in favour of Bayesian work, from carefully built up from axioms and ending with the conclusion that everything should be Bayesian, that in fact there's no option. Clearly frequentist work is incoherent and should be abandoned. So many people have put forward structures of this sort, structured arguments of this sort, and I felt that those who might take not quite as an extreme view really hadn't had their point of view put in quite as forceful a way. I mean, my own feeling, and I don't really want to get into an argument about Bayesian, non-Bayesian, so, is to be very tolerant of Bayesian work, but to feel that I'd like to feel that I wasn't really committing appalling sins in doing things in non-Bayesian ways, that in fact, in some sense, these two approaches could coexist. I mean, I take a rather eclectic point of view of that. There is perhaps a distinction between a lot of people who do quite a lot of frequentist work who are sort of reasonably tolerant about Bayesian people. A contrast between that and the rather holier-than-thou attitude of some Bayesians. I'm not talking to anyone present here.
But if you look back at sort of RSS discussion papers of 40 years ago, I mean, there's a lot of work on foundations of people trying to find a unified approach to statistics, which you don't see now so much. I mean, is that a development you welcome towards a slightly more, perhaps, pragmatic approach?
Well, I mean, I think my own approach certainly is pragmatic, but nevertheless, I think I'd like to have someone else do a reasoned argument in favour of pragmatism. So I'm not prepared to.
Good. Perhaps we will just distract from that topic. I have a less controversial quote, but one that you used at the start of the lecture, which I recall being at in 1984, from Sir Arthur Eddington. Life is proverbially uncertain, but few things are more secure than the assets of a life assurance company. And at that time, you used it as an introduction to the importance of survival analysis, and you were speaking particularly about the major advances which took place with David Cox's 1972 paper. But I thought maybe what we might do is explore a little bit about survival analysis before that time. And can you comment a little bit about that as a research area in the immediate post-war period?
Yeah, I think it might be worth perhaps looking at this a little more general and thinking of the whole problem of relating a response variable simultaneously to a large number of explanatory variables. I mean, the classical methodology here is multiple regression, which was perfectly well known, of course, a long time ago. It was a bit of a problem doing it in the old days when you had to do all your calculating with a Hans-Brunsviga. Difficult handling more than about 2 or 3 explanatory variables. But nevertheless, the methodology was there. But I think the problem that exercised quite a lot of people was really, are we right in using this sort of linear model with normal errors? What shouldn't we be thinking about more complex situations? And 2 areas, of course, that cropped up immediately as terribly important was, first of all, the situation when you had binary responses or binomially distributed proportions as the responses, and survival data. Now, the first of these, the binary situation, in a sense, was fairly well known. I mean, an approach to it was fairly well known because it went back to probit analysis in the 1930s, which was widely used in biological assay. Fisher had written an explanation of the maximum likelihood solution, and this had been worked on by people like Irwin and later by Finney in his book. There were also discussions about the logistic transform as an alternative to the probit one, but this all seemed to merge naturally into situations where people talked about logistic regression. There was a paper by Naylor which I remember explaining logistic regression quite well around about 1960-ish, I suppose. Programs became available. So that, and then of course it merged into generalized linear models. So all that seemed to work out quite well. Now with survival data, in a sense, the problem is more awkward because your response variable survival is apt to have very awkward distributions, not easily fitted into a particular framework, and you had the problem of censoring. But one approach had been very well known about it, namely the use of life tables for centuries. These had been used by actuaries, been used in studying population development, and there were papers, I suppose in the 1950s, by Berkson and Gage, Merrill and Schulman, showing very clearly how life table methods could be used for clinical problems, for following the follow-up of patients with particular diseases, for instance. So if you had, say, a simple contrast between two groups, then you could work out a life table for each and compare them. Greenwood had got the asymptotic formula for the variance of a life table, an estimate of the life table survival function. Irwin had worked on the expectation of life for a truncated distribution, and that seemed okay, provided you had just a fairly simple comparison. But obviously if you have a very large number of explanatory variables in the multiple regression sort of framework, you can't be doing life tables for every possible combination. And so that seemed to be a problem. And gradually the idea came up of trying to formulate linear models with regression type models with particular transforms, allowing for censoring. So.
Yeah, could you talk a bit about that? I mean, you're looking at the exponential.
Yeah, well, the exponential is an obvious one to start with. I think I'd always been very impressed by some sort of very simple results for exponential distribution with censoring. If you have, for instance, sampling from a single distribution with some censoring, your maximum likelihood estimate of the hazard parameter is just number of deaths over total survival period, measuring up to death or censoring. And so it seemed a nice one to work with. And Zelen and Polyfeigl in the 1960s had produced a linear model solution for regressing the mean of an exponential distribution linearly on predicting variables, but without censoring. And Zippin and I worked on exactly the same model, but with censoring. That was really rather a pity because it's a foolish model. You see, if you have a linear model for the mean, you can actually get predicted values, the mean being negative, and no one's ever come across negative survival. So obviously we ought to have been using the log of the parameter. And Glasser, I think, wrote a paper doing this a year or so later. So there was a bundle of papers trying models of this sort, and I expect people then tried Weibull distributions as well as exponential. But it obviously working out to the real solution, which was David Cox's solution of proportional hazards, the semi-parametric one. And so that came out in the 1970s and seemed the obvious way forward.
Choosing between semi-parametric and a parametric model for the underlying hazard, and what do you feel is perhaps appropriate in many medical applications? Well,
I would have thought the semi-parametric one was appropriate because the nature of survival functions is often really rather odd. You know, sometimes they're vaguely exponential, but sometimes they do all very odd things. And I think perhaps it's a bit dangerous to actually assume a particular parametric form.
I got another quote. This is when you were doing the exponential with survival, you said you did the result. You got the results with the aid of a computer, which brings the whole general point of the role of computing in statistics, and particularly survival analysis.
Well, of course, it's been an extraordinary transformation during the time I worked in statistics, because when looking at the first practical class in statistics during the 1940s here and under Irwin, we were all using hand Brunswickers. And when I first went into the MRC unit in 1947, all the people had hand Brunswickers. I mean, there were a few, although during the war I had worked with electrical machines which actually did the wheel, the turning of the cranking electrically. But there was a great reliance on really very crude computing methods. So for a long time people were using electric calculating machines, the Frieden and the Marchant and the Munro being the usual one. And then electronic ones. And then gradually, of course, the computer came in. Well, many people were, a few people were very far-sighted about computers. I mean, one thinks of people like Frank Yates supporting work at Rothamsted, and David Finney, who headed the computer board during a period. And they realized that this was the thing to be encouraging, and got on with it. I was slow at doing that, so we gradually, during I think the 1960s, started to have in the department at the London School of Hygiene, where I then was, started to have a computer. But it was a slow business. And so I tended not myself to be a programmer. I didn't particularly like programming, I wasn't good at it, so I had other people helping, I'm afraid. So that remark you just quoted was because some friend of mine had actually done the computer.
Yeah. I mean, development of survival analysis is so central to biostatistics over the last 30, 40 years. You know, how do you think it reflects the way in which the whole subject has developed?
The whole subject of biostatistics?
Yes, or scientific development.
No, it occurs to me, thinking about the survival data development, that really was a matter of a lot of people sort of realizing that here was an important problem somehow had to be solved, and sort of working away at the edges of it gradually, trying to get a little bit nearer the center of it, and then a rather bright idea coming along, which revolutionized the other thing. So that was a very jerky development. In other areas, I think you've got slow developments without any particular crucial impetus in the middle. I don't know that I can really generalize about that.
Peter, this is fascinating. Our time is running out, so certainly it's wonderful to be able to share this time with you. I think you have agreed, though, that you're willing to consider some questions from those who are watching. So there is a microphone which is available. So if anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question, if you could just wait till the mic gets to you and maybe give your name as well for posterity's sake.
Chris Moran. Thanks, Peter. That was fascinating. There's another quote I used of yours in a paper or two of mine, something like this. Data-dependent allocation methods are precisely the sort of contribution that statistics ought to be contributing to clinical trials. Yet the gap between theory and practice is appallingly large. That was the gist of what you said in the paper in '85, I think. What do you think has happened to the gap between theory and practice? Do you see it getting narrower or getting bigger?
Well, I really ought to be asking people like you about this. I mean, I've been out of this really for 15 years or so. So I don't know what's happening. I mean, what I see is a very large number of papers, most of which are very theoretical. If I look at the journals, I can't understand them terribly well myself. I suppose other people do. But I mean, so there's obviously a tremendous amount of very theoretical work going on. On the other hand, what I do notice is that a lot of the work is related to practical problems. If you look at, for instance, statistics in medicine or applied statistics journals, there's a lot of fairly heavy theoretical stuff being applied to practical problems. So I suppose there is always a gap that is closed in a sense. But I haven't got much of a feeling as to whether it's widening or not.
Sorry, can I butt in? About the sort of specific thing that Chris was asking about adaptive trials. You know, there does seem to be more interest now, certainly the phase 2 type studies within the pharmaceutical industry on actual sort of data adaptive studies. I don't know whether you've got any feelings about it.
Well, I think we've got to, I suppose, be clear what sort of sphere we're talking about. I mean, I've had some arguments with people about adaptive trials in phase 3 as to whether, for instance, the idea of adapting the allocation proportions to different treatments ought to be introduced, which has, of course, the immediate attraction that you're tending to put more patients on the apparently better treatment. But it's not quite clear to me that this is the right thing to do in terms of getting as clear an answer as possible about the merits of treatments. It has the danger, I think, of making the benefits of randomization very difficult to apply. So I haven't been too keen on the idea of that sort of adaptive sampling in phase 3. I think there's a different case in phase 2 where you're actually trying to work your way towards a solution. And in a sense, the more you can shift around and try different things, the better. What do you think?
Oh, I agree.
Other comments or questions?
Sheila Bird. Peter, do you think there's been much less attention now in our courses and teaching of statistics on experimental design? The thought that all risk analysis can solve any problem?
You're asking whether there have been less.
Yes, whether we've lost sight in statistics
Lost sight of experimental
the importance
design.
of experimental design.
I don't know. I think there certainly has been very much a pushing of experimental design into the background. I think probably with the pushing of agricultural research into the background. So that in fact, that I think has always been the main upholder, as it were, of work in experimental design. I don't know. I hadn't actually been aware that it was actually. You're suggesting it's being neglected. That in fact there isn't so much.
So I wonder if that's,
Yeah.
if that's the
Yeah.
case, if in our training in statistics we pay as much attention to experimental design as would have been the case in the past.
Yes. I don't know.
Any other comments or questions? If not, again, Peter, thank you very much for sharing with us in this way. It's been fascinating and illuminating. And I'd like to hope that we have the opportunity to do it again and explore other things. But thank you very much.
Thank you.